Shalom. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Vayera, the fourth portion in the book of Bereshit, Genesis. Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father, known for his trait of kindness, is the personification of chesed, loving kindness. And indeed, Parashat Vayera is all about chesed. But this portion also features some of the 10 trials with which God tested Avraham, ending with the 10th and final test, known as Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. Not too much loving kindness there, or so it would seem. So hard to understand the concept of God's command to offer Isaac. But Avraham passed all of these tests with flying colors. Those trials, in chronological order, are: he had to hide for 13 years from King Nimrod, who sought to kill him. Nimrod threw Avraham into a fiery furnace. God commanded Avraham to leave his family and homeland. Then as soon as he arrives in the land of Canaan, a famine forces him to leave and go to Egypt. Sarah is taken by Pharaoh in Egypt. Avraham has to go off to war to rescue his nephew Lot. And then God tells him that his descendants will suffer under 4 kingdoms. God commands Avraham to circumcise himself and his son Ishmael. God commands him to banish Hagar and Ishmael. And finally, God commands Avraham to offer Isaac upon the altar. But, as we said, really, this parsha is all about chesed. First, we encounter the magnanimous trait of chesed, of Avraham's kindness, in welcoming guests, unknown guests, on the 3rd day after his circumcision, a very hot day at that. Avraham runs to greet them and bows before them and insists that they come and eat with him. He feeds them and waits on them, as we read, and Avraham hastened to the tent of Sarah, and he said, "Hasten 3 se'ah of meal and fine flour, knead and make cakes." And to the cattle did Avraham run, and he took a calf, tender and good, and he gave it to the youth, and he hastened to prepare it. We also find that Avraham prayed for the people of Sodom, even though they were exceedingly evil. In fact, their behavior was the opposite of chesed, which shows how special he was, how connected he was to his spiritual source of chesed. But as great as Avraham's chesed was, as it was manifest in this Torah portion, so was the wicked people of Sodom's horrific exploitation. We read, chapter 9 and verse 4, "When they had not yet retired, the people of the city, the people of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, the entire populace from every end of the city, and they called to Lot and said to him, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us and let us be intimate with them.' Lot, who chose to live in Sodom and knew their local customs, addressed the crowd and tried to rectify the situation, but with perverted chesed. He was willing to sacrifice his daughters' lives to save his guests. We read, "And Lot came out to them to the entrance, and he shut the door behind him. And he said, 'My brethren, please do not do evil. Behold now, I have 2 daughters who were not intimate with a man. I will bring them out to you, and do to them as you see fit. Only to these men do nothing, because they have come under the shadow of my roof.'" So Lot is willing to abandon his daughters to gang rape in order to bestow kindness upon his visitors. This perversion, this topsy-turvy, backwards ethical view, seems to be a local thing, a local problem. Because here also, in our portion of Vayera, Avimelech allowed himself to take Sarah against her will, and afterwards he preaches ethics to Avraham. And Avimelech summoned Avraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? And what have I sinned against you, that you have brought upon me and upon my kingdom a great sin? Deeds that are not done you have done to me. What did you see that you did this thing?" And Avraham said, "For I said, surely there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." But Avraham still prays for him, just as he prayed for the people of Sodom. So yeah, we're learning all about chesed, but what is it? What is kindness? Who or what standard defines it? And what is this element of the fear of God that Avraham is interjecting? So there are different types of kindness. Sometimes kindness is disguised as harshness. And sometimes something that's not kindness at all is disguised as kindness. Now, you must open up your hearts in the deepest way now. So what I'm saying, actually, the whole portion deals with chesed, with kindness. Parashat Vayera also teaches a great lesson in kindness, for example, through the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael. When Sarah perceived that Ishmael's demeanor jeopardized Isaac's spiritual survival, Sarah tells Abraham, "Drive out this handmaid and her son, for the son of this handmaid shall not inherit with my son, with Isaac." Now this seemed like a very bad thing to do to Avraham, as verse 11 reads, "But the matter greatly displeased Avraham concerning his son. But God said to Avraham, Be not displeased concerning the lad and concerning your handmaid. Whatever Sarah tells you, hearken to her voice, for in Isaac will your seed be called." So God is telling Avraham, Sarah sees better than you. She sees better than you. Listen to her. On this basis, our sages teach that Sarah was greater in prophecy than Avraham. She saw further. She understood that the presence of Ishmael and Hagar would prevent blessing from coming into the world through Yitzchak. Now clearly, the commandment of the Akedah, God's instructions to Avraham to bind Yitzchak, certainly seem to be the pinnacle of din, of harshness. No chesed here, right? And he said, "Please take your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac, and go away to the land of Moriah and bring him up there for a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will tell you." That's chapter 22 and verse 2. Yet afterwards, it transpires that this event actually results in the pinnacle of eternal divine chesed, with the Jewish people receiving a great heavenly blessing, that I shall surely bless you and greatly increase your offspring like the stars of the heavens and like the sands of the seashore, and your offspring shall inherit the gate of its enemy. And not only this, but God now declares, after the binding, that all of humanity shall be blessed in the merit of Avraham and Yitzchak, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your offspring because you have listened to my voice. It's towards the end of chapter 22. Now, we're all tested, all the time, every day. Everything is a test. And the tests are tailor-made for each of us. And they're not on our terms. That's why it's a test. So Avraham was tested with 10 trials. He endured and passed all of these tests. But it was only after the 10th trial, that of the binding, that Hashem said, chapter 22 and verse 12, "Now I know that you fear God and did not spare your son, your only son, from me." Like, huh? Didn't God already know of Abraham's dedication from the first test? This is really difficult to understand. Did God only know now that Avraham feared him? After all, Avraham was ready to give up his life for his belief in Hashem, was thrown into Nimrod's fiery furnace of Ur Kasdim for the sake of Hashem's name, and all the other tests also, they all certainly testify to Abraham's belief in and fear of God. So, we've already learned that Avraham is the total embodiment of the attribute of kindness. And nowhere is this more conspicuous than in the opening verses of our portion this week, where Avraham actually abandons God himself, as it were, who came to visit him on the third and most painful day following the circumcision, in the heat of the day, in the unnatural, fabricated heat, which God arranged especially that day in order to spare his friend Avraham the trouble of having to tend to the needs of guests who may be found outside passing by. God made it especially hot so that no one would be about. But seeing how disappointed Avraham was at his inability to bestow kindness upon wayfarers, God then brought him 3 angels in the guise of men. Upon seeing them, Avraham quickly rose up and prepared a meal for them. In fact, it was based on Avraham's behavior and the zealous, excited manner in which he received these guests, preferring to bestow kindness upon strangers rather than visit with God himself. It was upon this that our sages state that giving hospitality to guests is greater than receiving the divine presence. For at the very same time, Avraham was conversing with God himself, and Hashem appeared to him in Elonei Mamre. But then Avraham left God to wait until he finished taking care of the guests, feeding them and accompanying them. Well, listen carefully. Okay, so Avraham is the man of unparalleled kindness. But perhaps one might think, maybe Avraham simply couldn't help himself from being the person he was. Maybe Avraham was a man of kindness because it was his nature. It was the natural inclination of his heart, but not because he wanted to do Hashem's will in particular. He was just a nice guy, just as today. There are people who consider themselves highly ethical and moral, but they do not believe in God, mock those who do, and altogether have no use for a God in their world. So once again, I ask, who or what standard defines what chesed is? Lot? Avimelech? Maybe people today who would do anything to rescue an animal but are all in favor of killing children in the womb? So open up your heart in the deepest way. This is why God tested Avraham with the trial of the Akedah, binding Isaac, the commandment to bind Yitzchak and offer him as an offering. This command and the act itself was such a manifestation of yira, of fear and awe of God, whose root is gevurah, divine strength, not of chesed, the attribute of loving kindness. In fact, this test, like actually all of Abraham's tests, was the diametric opposite of the attribute of chesed and called upon him to exercise, to cull forth inner strengths that went against his nature. It was the diametric opposite of everything that Avraham was all about and stood for and lived for. That's why it was a tailor-made test for him. Now, were Avraham to slaughter Isaac in the fulfillment of God's command, this would be the cessation of all chesed emanating, that is, from Avraham's house by his descendants. And what about God's previous words in chapter 18 and verse 19? So that he will command his sons and his household after him, and they will observe the way of Hashem to do righteousness and judgment. Thus we are taught that the angels cried at the event of the binding of Isaac. The Midrash relates that, and I quote, "As soon as Abraham had bound Isaac and had taken up the knife, and he was crying, his eyes shedding tears for the mercy he felt for his son, tears that fell into Yitzchak's eyes, but yet the heart of Avraham was set with firm resolve and even joy at fulfilling the will of his Creator. The angels above were gathered together, and they too shed tears, and they cried out, echoing the words of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 33, highways have become desolate, the wayfarer has stopped. Meaning, their concern was that as a result of Avraham fulfilling the divine command, the binding of Isaac, who would be there to carry on his important work of bringing guests into the home? Wayfarers would be abandoned with no address to turn to. Chesed, kindness, would no longer emanate from his house. But since Avraham did pass this test, as God declared, "For now I know that you fear God," it also was established beyond doubt. It became clarified retroactively that also all of his past acts of chesed had always been done on account of his fear and awe of Hashem, the attribute known as the fear of heaven, and not on account of his natural inclination of his heart. Thus, his final test proved who he had always been and clarified that the results of all his tests had proved positive. This is how we can understand God's words, "For now I know that you fear God." Chesed, performed based on one's own moral compass, devoid of true fear of God, can turn into chesed of sin. For example, an overabundance, an unchecked feeling based on emotion, can easily become unbridled and morph into forbidden love. This is known as fallen chesed. Thus, forbidden familial relationships are called chesed in the negative sense. Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 17 tells us, "And a man who takes his sister, whether his father's daughter or his mother's daughter, and sees her nakedness, and she sees his nakedness, it is a disgraceful act, and they shall be cut off before the eyes of the members of their people. He uncovered his sister's nakedness, he shall bear his sin." The word in the verse here, in Leviticus 20 and verse 17, the word translated as disgraceful is in fact in Hebrew none other than the word chesed, the word indicating kindness. Why does the Torah call a disgraceful act of immorality chesed? Because, as the classic commentator and linguist, the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, explains, the disgrace of immorality is the product of overindulgence. Too much chesed, unchanneled, not tempered by the fear of heaven. By the way, this section of Leviticus is included in the Torah reading for the afternoon service of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the highest and holiest day of the year, in the afternoon service at literally the height of the intense spiritual power of the day. Why should we be reading about such an unseemly thing on Yom Kippur afternoon, the day we are cleansed of all sin and start fresh? Because it is a stark reminder of the limitations, the frail vulnerability of the human being, the stark reality of human nature, what a person can easily become if left to the devices of his own moral compass. This is why we find so many verses in the Torah in which the word mishpat, meaning justice, is connected with the word tzedakah, which can be translated as righteousness, but specifically refers to charity and kindness to others. Regarding Avraham, Torah states right here, chapter 18 and verse 19, "For I have known him because he commands his sons and his household after him that they should keep the way of Hashem to perform charity and justice, in order that Hashem bring upon Abraham that which he spoke concerning him." Regarding King David, we find in 2 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 15, "And David reigned over all of Israel, and David administered justice and charity for all his people." Regarding Solomon, it states, Kings 1 chapter 10 and verse 9, "Blessed be Hashem your God, who preferred to place you on the throne of Israel. Because of Hashem's love for Israel forever, he appointed you as king to do justice and charity." And thus, it is stated regarding the future redemption, Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 27, "Zion shall be redeemed through justice, and those who return to her through charity." And the reason that Torah connects tzedakah, charity, to mishpat, justice, is to exclude deviant acts of chesed based on one's own definition from being done, from becoming the norm. Such acts may ostensibly appear at first glance as chesed, but are actually very destructive. Thus the sage Rabbi Eliezer taught, "Whoever performs acts of charity and justice is reckoned as if he filled the entire world with chesed," as it states in Psalms 33, "Who loves charity and justice, the chesed of Hashem fills the earth." The Torah is teaching us that it's not such a simple thing to do chesed properly. It's not self-evident. True acts of kindness can be scarce. The kindness of a person who fears God is real. A person who fears Hashem can do chesed properly. Chesed with mishpat, kindness tempered by justice as defined by God.